It all began like any ordinary road trip. One of those long drives you take to unwind, with the open road stretching out ahead. I was tired, but nothing out of the ordinary. Carol and I had been driving for hours, when we finally decided to stop at the first convenience store we saw. It was one of those quiet, forgotten places, dimly lit, with the hum of a flickering fluorescent light above. I needed a break, a quick drink, something cold to refresh me before we got back on the road. We pulled into the parking lot and walked inside. The store was small, the kind of place that didn't attract much attention. Tucked away off the highway, the cashier behind the counter was a woman in her early 30s, tall, with dark brown hair. She was wearing suspenders, which immediately caught my eye. It wasn't something I'd see every day, but it wasn't weird either. Just unusual enough to make me pause for a second. I remember her face clearly, but there was nothing about her that screamed important. I grabbed a Gatorade, walked up to the counter, and paid. As I turned to leave, Carol, my travel companion, pointed to another convenience store across the street. It seemed like a good idea to check it out, so we decided to give it a shot. I didn't think much of it at the time, just another stop on the way to nowhere. But the second we walked through the door of the second store, a cold wave of unease swept over me. It felt like my stomach just dropped. I glanced up at the counter and stopped dead in my tracks. The cashier looked exactly the same as the woman from the first store. Same face, same dark hair, same height. I stared at her, trying to convince myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But there was no denying it. She was a mirror image of the first woman. I could feel my heart race as I tried to make sense of it. The woman noticed me staring at her, and her gaze shifted, almost uncomfortably. I could tell I was making her nervous, but I couldn't look away. The feeling in my gut grew stronger, like a warning bell ringing in the back of my mind. Finally, I had to ask, "Do you have a twin? Or a sister?" My voice came out shakier than I intended, but I had to know. I felt like I was going crazy. She frowned and gave me a confused look. "No, I'm an only child," she replied, her tone bordering on defensive. Her eyes narrowed as if questioning my sanity. "That's a weird question," she added, a hint of skepticism in her voice. I tried to explain, to rationalize the situation, but my words felt pointless. She just stared at me, clearly uncomfortable. I could feel the tension rising, thick and suffocating. The feeling in my chest tightened, and my stomach churned with uncertainty. Something was wrong. Carol tugged on my arm, pulling me out of my trance. "Let's go, weirdo," she muttered, dragging me toward the door. I could tell she was confused, but she didn't seem to get why I was so shaken. Once outside, I tried to explain to her what I'd seen, but she just shrugged it off. "You've been on the road too long, you're just tired." I don't remember what the other cashier looked like, and honestly, they all looked the same to me. She laughed it off, but I couldn't let it go. I was convinced I wasn't imagining things. I needed answers. "Let's go back," I said. Carol was annoyed but went along with it. We walked back to the first store, and the feeling in my gut got worse with every step. But when we walked in, everything had changed. The woman behind the counter was completely different. This time, a middle-aged woman with light hair was standing there, short and slightly hunched, nothing at all like the tall, dark-haired woman I had seen earlier. I froze. My mind spun as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It was impossible. There was no way the first cashier and this one were the same person. Carol seemed irritated now. "See, it's just your imagination," she said, shaking her head. But I knew what I saw. This wasn't normal. There was no way I could confuse them. The woman in the first store didn't even look like she belonged to the same generation. She didn't even resemble the other woman in the slightest. I stood there, feeling a wave of dizziness wash over me, and tried to explain. But Carol had already turned to leave. She didn't understand. She couldn't. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. What was going on? Was I going insane? The nagging feeling in my chest didn't let up, and I had to escape. We needed to get back on the road, away from whatever strange force was twisting reality. We had to keep going. Our next stop was a gas station. There was no one around, just an empty lot with a couple of pumps. It was eerie how quiet it was. The building where you pay was dark and silent. I thought nothing of it at first, just another odd stop in a long drive. But as I walked inside with Carol, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. Carol took her time picking out a drink, while I paid for my gas. Everything was normal for a few seconds, but then the strangest thing happened. We turned to leave the store, and the world shifted. The parking lot, which had been completely empty when we arrived, was now jam-packed. Every pump had a car, and there were even cars lined up, stretching all the way down the lot. The lot was so full, it looked like we had walked into the middle of rush hour. At one of the busiest gas stations in the state, the scene felt distorted, like we had stepped into an alternate version of reality. The worst part? The people. They were all staring at us. Every single one of them. Their eyes followed us as we walked back to the car. There was no mistaking it. This was not just curiosity. It was something darker, something unnatural. I felt like I was suffocating, like we were intruding on a place that didn't belong to us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Carol noticed it too. "This is messed up," she said quietly, her voice shaky. We rushed to the car, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I tried to start the engine as fast as I could, desperate to escape the strange scene. But my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. We sped away, not daring to look back. We didn't speak much for a while. I couldn't focus on anything other than that horrible feeling in my gut. It was like we had stepped into a different reality for a split second. And now everything was wrong. But the horror didn't end there. As we drove, trying to shake off the unease, a car passed Yusan old Toyota Sienna, with a cracked windshield. The crack was huge, running across the entire glass, forming a web of fractures. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Carol made a joke about the poor condition of the car, trying to lighten the mood, but it didn't help. And then, not 10 minutes later, the same minivan passed us again. Same cracked windshield, same exact spiderweb crack. My heart skipped a beat. How was that possible? We hadn't seen it again on the road. It didn't make sense. We'd been driving in a straight line at a steady speed. How could the same car, the same minivan, have gotten ahead of us without us noticing? We were both on edge now. Carol kept repeating, "Oh my God, what is happening?" Her voice was a mix of fear and disbelief. I could see the panic rising in her. I pushed the gas pedal to the floor, desperate to get away from this nightmare. But the minivan stayed in my mind, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I glanced at the GPS to try to ground myself in something familiar. But when I looked at the screen, it showed something impossible. An hour had passed. We'd only been on the road for about 30 minutes. The time hadn't made sense. The road hadn't made sense. Nothing had made sense since we had stopped at that first convenience store. We kept driving, and I tried not to let my fear show. But every part of me was screaming that something was terribly wrong. Eventually, we made it back onto the highway. The only thing that seemed real anymore. The nightmare was over, or so we thought. But when we finally made it home, hours later, it felt like we had woken from a strange, disconnected dream. The whole experience haunted me, and it still does. I've done research, trying to find an explanation. But all I found were other stories of people who had experienced similar encounters. I don't know if it was a glitch in reality or something else. But the eerie feeling I had, like something was watching. Something was out of places, something I'll never forget. The worst part wasn't what we saw, it was the feeling. The nagging sensation that things weren't right. That we were being watched, controlled, and manipulated by forces beyond our comprehension. I'll never be able to explain it, and I don't think I ever want to. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you or someone you know the story of despair or horror to share, you can send it to the Nightmare Moment channel at this email address.